March 7th, 1942. Arctic Ocean, 73 degrees north. The metal of the bridge railing felt like fire beneath Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland's gloved hands, a paradoxical burn of extreme cold that penetrated the wool and leather as if they weren't there. Frozen spray coated every surface of the USS Gallant with a treacherous sheen, transforming the Liberty ship into a floating iceberg. The thermometer read 40 degrees, the point where Fahrenheit and Celsius converged in mutual surrender to the Arctic's brutality. Visibility had dropped to less than 100 yards, the world beyond the bow reduced to swirling curtains of snow and sea smoke rising from the black water. "German reconnaissance plane reported at 600, sir," shouted Executive Officer William Davis, his voice nearly lost in the howling 50-knot gale that tore across the deck. "Could be bombers within the hour." Copeland nodded, his face a mask of ice crystals that had formed in his beard. 6 hours of daylight in these northern latitudes gave them precious little time to hide from Luftwaffe predators hunting overhead. The convoy, PQ-13, 31 merchant vessels and 6 escorts, had spread out more than was safe, casualties of the storm that had raged for 3 consecutive days. 19 of those vessels carried American-built M3 Stuart tanks, 223 machines in total, destined for the desperate Soviet defense of Moscow, where temperatures were somehow even more punishing than here on the open sea. "Mr. Davis, sound general quarters," Copeland said, his Missouri drawl still detectable beneath the clipped tones of command. "And get a message to the convoy commander. Tell him the Gallant's radar has picked up surface contacts bearing 045, range approximately 16 nautical miles." The message confirmed what Copeland had feared since departing Iceland 6 days earlier. The Germans had found them. Somewhere in the grey murk ahead, destroyers of the Kriegsmarine were moving to intercept the convoy's path. The naval escort, 3 British destroyers, 2 corvettes, and an anti-aircraft cruiser might not be enough. Not against the combined threat of German air power from Norway, U-boats lurking beneath the waves, and now surface raiders. Churchill had called this route the worst journey in the world, and the statistics supported his assessment. Of the 7 previous Arctic convoys that had attempted the Murmansk run, 3 had lost more than 20% of their ships. The most recent, PQ-12, had lost a quarter of its vessels to submarine attacks alone. The crews had taken to calling it the route of the damned. Copeland moved to the chart table, secured behind a windscreen that did little to block the howling gale. The convoy's position placed them at the most dangerous point of the journey, too far from Iceland to turn back, too distant from Murmansk to race ahead. The Kola Inlet, their destination, lay 500 miles to the southeast through waters patrolled by the Luftwaffe's Norway-based bombers during the day and stalked by U-boats through the long Arctic night. At 33, Copeland was younger than most merchant captains. The naval reserve officer had been thrust into command of the Gallant when the merchant marine officer shortage became critical after Pearl Harbor. His background, 4 years at Annapolis, followed by a return to civilian life and maritime academy training, made him a hybrid, neither fully naval nor merchant marine in his approach. That unorthodox background would prove both his greatest weakness and his salvation in the hours ahead. "Captain," called the radioman, his face grim as he handed over a decoded message. "Flash traffic from convoy commander." The paper trembled in Copeland's hands, not from fear but from the violent shuddering of the ship as it crashed through 30-foot seas. The message was brief, its implications enormous. "Tirpitz, sortied from Altafjord. Stop believed moving to intercept. Stop Admiralty orders. Convoy to scatter forthwith." The Tirpitz, Germany's mightiest battleship, sister to the Bismarck, armed with 8 15-inch guns that could obliterate any ship in the convoy from beyond the horizon. A behemoth that had haunted the nightmares of every Allied sailor in northern waters since her deployment to Norway. Scattering the convoy meant abandoning the mutual protection of concentrated fire and coordinated evasion. It meant each ship for itself, picking its own path through U-boat-infested waters. For most, It would be a death sentence. The lookout's shout cut through Copeland's thoughts. Aircraft! Multiple contacts, bearing 270! On the horizon, barely visible through breaks in the snow squalls, dark shapes resolved into the distinctive silhouettes of Ju-88 bombers, at least a dozen, flying in tight formation just above the wavetops. Davis looked at Copeland, waiting for orders. The other officers on the bridge held their breath. The Gallant carried 6 M3 tanks in her forward hold and 2,000 tons of ammunition aft. A direct hit would vaporize the ship and everyone aboard. Copeland studied his charts one final time, his mind racing through calculations of fuel, speed, ice conditions, and German patrol patterns. Then he made a decision that naval historians would later describe as either tactical brilliance or suicidal insanity. "Helmsman," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos about to envelop them. "Come to course 020. 020, aye, sir," replied the helmsman, confusion evident in his voice. "But, sir, that's directly toward the Norwegian coast," Copeland finished for him. "I know." As the Gallant heeled into its turn, Copeland keyed the radio to issue orders that contradicted every convoy protocol and survival doctrine taught since the war began. The USS Gallant would not scatter with the others. Instead, she would run a gauntlet that no Allied merchant ship had yet survived, straight toward enemy-held shores where the ice pack might offer their only chance of concealment, and then along the Norwegian coastline to Murmansk. The insane Arctic run had begun. July 23, 1910. Maryville, Missouri. The scent of fresh-cut hay hung heavy in the summer air as 8-year-old Robert Copeland raced across his father's field, pretending the wooden stick in his hand was the tiller of a mighty ship. Born in this landlocked farming community 75 miles north of Kansas City, young Robert seemed an unlikely candidate for maritime greatness. His father, James Copeland, worked the 160-acre family farm, coaxing corn and wheat from the stubborn Missouri soil, while his mother taught at the one-room schoolhouse 3 miles down the dirt road. "Bobby was always drawing ships," recalled his younger sister Margaret in a 1955 interview. "He'd never seen the ocean, mind you, but from those books he checked out of the Carnegie Library, he could tell you every detail of a 3-masted schooner or an ironclad battleship." The farm boy's obsession with the sea defined his childhood. At 16, against his father's wishes but with his mother's quiet support, Copeland secured an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy through the intervention of Congressman Ralph Rigney, who had been impressed by the boy's perfect scores on the entrance examination. At Annapolis, Copeland distinguished himself in navigation and tactical exercises, graduating in the top 5th of his class in 1932. But the Great Depression offered few opportunities for newly minted ensigns. Budget cuts forced a reduction in naval personnel, and Copeland reluctantly accepted an honorable discharge in 1934, joining the Naval Reserve while pursuing civilian maritime credentials at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. For 6 years, he served aboard merchant vessels plying the Atlantic trade routes, developing an intimate understanding of commercial shipping operations that few naval officers possessed. "He knew both worlds," explained retired Admiral James Holloway, who later served with Copeland. "He understood naval tactics and discipline, but he also knew firsthand the practical challenges of merchant operations." That combination was extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable when war came. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Copeland was serving as second officer aboard the SS American Farmer. His Naval Reserve status resulted in immediate recall to active duty, and by December 1941, he had received command of the newly launched USS Gallant, a 7,276-ton Liberty ship built in just 42 days at the Baltimore shipyards. Liberty ships represented America's industrial answer to the U-boat threat. Standardized, prefabricated vessels constructed in sections and welded together on assembly lines, they could be built in under 2 months, an engineering miracle that allowed the United States to replace tonnage faster than German submarines could sink it. But speed of construction came with compromises. Their welded hulls proved vulnerable to brittle fracturing in cold waters. Their steam engines generated only 2,500 horsepower, pushing the fully loaded vessels at a maximum of 11 knots, barely fast enough to maintain station in convoy, much less outrun pursuers. "They gave me a ship that was slow, underarmed and unarmoured," Copeland wrote in his service journal. "And then they ordered me to take her through the most dangerous waters on Earth." The Arctic convoys had begun in August 1941, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Desperate to keep their Russian allies in the fight, Britain and America established the northern supply route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Russian ports kept ice-free by the Gulf Stream's final northern extension. The 2,000-mile journey from Iceland skirted occupied Norway, placing the convoys within striking distance of German air and naval forces based along the Norwegian coast. Copeland assembled his crew with careful consideration. His executive officer, Lieutenant William Davis, had served aboard oil tankers in the Caribbean. Chief Engineer Malcolm Roberts had worked the Alaska run and understood the challenges of maintaining steam pressure in Arctic conditions. Boatswain Patrick O'Malley, at 52 the oldest man aboard, had survived 2 sinkings in the North Atlantic and wore his experience like armour against fear. The Soviet liaison officer, Captain Nikolai Petrov, joined the ship in Reykjavik, bringing with him precise loading manifests for the cargo bound for the Eastern Front. Dark-eyed and taciturn, he moved about the ship with the wary alertness of a man who had seen too much combat in too little time. "The Red Army was losing 10,000 men daily," he told Copeland during their first meeting. "Without American tanks and trucks, Moscow would have fallen months earlier." "How many convoys have made it through?" Copeland asked him. Petrov's eyes narrowed. "Not enough." On March 1, 1942, Convoy PQ-13 assembled in the protected harbour of Hvalfjordur, Iceland. 31 merchant vessels, 19 American, 8 British, and 4 Panamanian flagged, arranged themselves in the precise grid formation that would, in theory, maximize their defensive capabilities while minimizing their vulnerability to torpedo attack. Naval Commander Louis Keppel gathered the merchant captains for a final briefing aboard the escort vessel HMS Scylla. "Gentlemen, I won't minimize the danger," Keppel said, his weathered face grave in the lamplight of the wardroom. "German long-range bombers from Norway can reach us throughout most of our journey. U-boat packs are actively patrolling our route, and we have reliable intelligence that surface raiders, possibly including the Tirpitz, are preparing to intercept convoys in the Barents Sea." As Keppel outlined their defensive protocols, Copeland studied the meteorological charts. A massive low-pressure system was moving into the Norwegian Sea, bringing blizzard conditions and 40-foot waves. Normally, such weather would delay departure. This time, Keppel saw it as an opportunity, a natural screen against Luftwaffe observation planes. The convoy departed at dawn on March 2nd, slipping through the submarine nets and past the protective minefields that guarded the approaches to Iceland. As the coastline receded behind them, Copeland stood on the bridge wing of the Gallant, watching ice begin to form on the forward rigging. Below in the holds, secured against shifting by an intricate web of chains and wooden bracing, sat 6 M3 Stuart tanks, 800 tons of ammunition, 300 tons of explosives, 200 jeeps, and crated aircraft parts. Heading into the gathering storm, Copeland understood with perfect clarity that the Gallant wasn't just carrying cargo. She was delivering America's promise that Russia would not fight Hitler alone. March 10th, 1942, Barents Sea. The first attack came 3 days after leaving Iceland. Copeland had just finished his morning coffee when the alarm bell shattered the relative quiet of the bridge. The distinctive drone of aircraft engines cut through the howling wind as 9 Ju-88 bombers emerged from the low cloud ceiling, their black crosses visible against the grey sky. "All hands to battle stations," Copeland shouted, grabbing his binoculars. The Gallant's meagre defences, 1 4-inch gun on the stern, 2 20mm anti-aircraft guns amidships, would provide little protection against a determined air attack. The first bombs fell wide, sending towering columns of water skyward 300 yards off the starboard beam. The ship rocked violently as near misses created underwater pressure waves that hammered against the hull. On the second pass, the German pilots adjusted their aim. "Hard to starboard," Copeland ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. The helmsman spun the wheel, and the Liberty ship heeled awkwardly into a turn that no naval architect had ever intended for its boxy hull. A stick of bombs straddled their previous position, the closest detonating just 50 feet from where they would have been. "They're coming around again, Captain," called the lookout. Copeland made a swift calculation. The Gallant couldn't outrun the bombers. She couldn't outfight them. Their only chance lay in the weather. "Take us into that squall line," he ordered, pointing toward a wall of snow and fog 2 miles ahead. "All ahead, fool!" The Gallant's engines laboured as the ship pushed through massive waves, each one burying the bow before the vessel would shudder and rise again. Ice formed faster than the crew could chip it away. 3 inches thick on the decks, 6 inches on the railings, dangerous weight accumulating on the superstructure and threatening to capsize the top-heavy vessel. Temperatures dropped another 5 degrees. "Captain," reported Chief Engineer Roberts as he arrived on the bridge, his coat crusted with ice. "We're having trouble maintaining steam pressure. Intake pipes are freezing faster than we can thaw them." The mercury had plummeted to 50 below zero. At such temperatures, metal became brittle, ropes snapped like glass, and exposed flesh froze in seconds. 4 crewmen had already suffered severe frostbite while attempting to clear ice from the forward gun mount. The ship found temporary shelter in the snowstorm, the Luftwaffe bombers unwilling to pursue into zero visibility conditions. But the respite came with its own dangers. Navigating blind through the heaving seas, Copeland relied on dead reckoning and his magnetic compass, itself increasingly unreliable as they approached the magnetic North Pole. Captain Petrov, the Soviet liaison, appeared at Copeland's elbow. "You handled that well," the Russian said, his English precise despite the thick accent. "But the air attack is only the beginning. My countrymen have learned that German U-boats hunt in groups of 3 to 5 in these waters." As if summoned by Petrov's words, the sonar operator called out, "Contact! Submarine bearing 045, range unknown but close." The nervous tension on the bridge was palpable. Every man aboard knew the grim math of submarine warfare. A typical U-boat carried 22 torpedoes. A single hit would almost certainly sink the Gallant, especially with her volatile cargo. The standard depth of a torpedo run was 15 feet, precisely where the ship's main holds were located. "Initiate evasive maneuvers," Copeland ordered. "Random course changes every 2 minutes. Sound the submarine alert." Throughout the ship, men donned bulky life jackets over their already substantial cold weather gear, knowing the bitter truth that survival in these waters, even in a lifeboat, could be measured in minutes rather than hours. The sea temperature of 28 degrees, kept from freezing only by its salt content, would kill a man through hypothermia in under 10 minutes. For 6 hours, the Gallant zigzagged through the blinding snowstorm, changing course and speed unpredictably to confound the U-boat's targeting calculations. Whether they succeeded in evading the submarine or whether it simply chose to seek easier prey among the scattered convoy vessels, they never knew for certain. As darkness fell, though true darkness never quite arrived this far north in early spring, Copeland received the first reports of convoy losses. 3 ships confirmed sunk, 2 more presumed lost. The Gallant had survived its first day of combat, but the cost to the convoy had been devastating. Dawn brought fresh horrors. The storm had cleared enough to reveal the destroyer HMS Verdun burning from bow to stern just 2 miles distant, victim of a U-boat attack in the night. Beyond it, the American freighter Steelworker was already half submerged, her bow pointing skyward as her stern settled beneath the waves. "My God!" whispered Davis as they watched helplessly. The Gallant couldn't stop to assist, another iron rule of convoy procedure. Stopping meant becoming a stationary target, sacrificing one ship to save another. The radio crackled with desperate transmissions from ships under attack across a 50-mile radius. The scatter order had achieved precisely what naval strategists feared most. It had transformed a defensible formation into isolated targets, each one vulnerable and alone. At 07:20 hours, the message arrived that would alter the course of their journey and earn Copeland both a court-martial recommendation and eventually the Navy Cross. The coded transmission from the Admiralty was brief but momentous. Intelligence confirms Tirpitz with 3 destroyer escort departed Alta Fjord. Stop all vessels, scatter immediately. Stop proceed independently to destination or return to Iceland, captain's discretion. Stop. The bridge fell silent as the implications became clear. The pride of the German fleet was hunting them. Against such a predator, the Gallant had no defense whatsoever. Copeland studied his charts, measuring distances with dividers, performing calculations in his notebook. After 5 minutes of tense silence, he looked up at his assembled officers. "Gentlemen," he said, tracing a line on the chart that made Davis's eyes widen in disbelief. "We're changing course. Set heading 030. "Sir," Davis said carefully, "that would take us directly toward the Norwegian coast, toward German-occupied territory." Copeland nodded. "Precisely where they'll never expect a lone Allied merchant ship to deliberately sail." March 10th, 1942. 50 miles northwest of the Norwegian coastline. "You're proposing we sail directly toward German-occupied territory?" Executive Officer Davis's voice carried the stunned disbelief of every officer gathered around the chart table. "That's suicide, sir." Copeland traced the route again with his divider. "Look here. The Germans maintain a 20-mile patrol zone off the Norwegian coast, focused on preventing infiltration by British commandos. Their radar installations are positioned to scan outward, watching for approaching Allied forces. But there's a blind spot, this area where the polar ice pack extends southward." Chief Engineer Roberts squinted at the chart. "You're suggesting we thread the needle between the ice pack and the coast?" "Exactly. We'll use the ice as concealment from the north and operate within 5 miles of the shoreline, too close for the coastal defense radars to effectively detect us." The navigation officer shook his head. "There are no proper charts for those waters, sir. The ice position changes daily, and there are uncharted shoals throughout that region." "I'm well aware of the navigational challenges," Copeland replied. "But consider our alternatives. The Tirpitz is hunting the main convoy track. U-boats are positioned along the traditional route. Continuing on our current course is almost certain destruction." Captain Petrov, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. "In my country, we have a saying. When the wolf pursues, sometimes you must run toward the bear." His dark eyes met Copeland's. "I believe your plan might work." Not everyone shared Petrov's assessment. The radio man, Seaman First Class Eric Holman, voiced what many were thinking. "With respect, Captain, we're hauling 6 tanks and enough ammunition to light up the night sky if we're hit. 1 patrol boat spots us. We're done for." Copeland understood their fear. He felt it himself, a cold knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. "I'm not ordering any man aboard to face these risks," he said quietly. "If anyone wishes to transfer to the lifeboats and attempt to rendezvous with other scattered convoy vessels, I'll note in the log that you left with my blessing." For 30 seconds, no one spoke. Then Bosun O'Malley's gravelly voice broke the silence. "Begging the captain's pardon, but the lifeboats would kill us quicker than the Germans. I'll take my chances with your crazy plan." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. "Very well," Copeland said. "Mr. Davis, bring us to course 030, all ahead standard, and maintain radio silence from this point forward." The USS Gallant altered course, her bow swinging toward the Norwegian coastline. For the next 18 hours, they sailed in tense silence. Every man aboard keenly aware that they were heading into a trap of their own making. At dawn the following day, they sighted the first ice floes. massive chunks of pack ice that had broken away from the polar cap and drifted southward. Beyond them lay the solid edge of the ice pack itself, a white wall extending to the northern horizon. "Reduce speed to 1/3, Copeland ordered. "Lookouts to the bow and both wings. We'll parallel the ice edge at a distance of 1,000 yards. The Gallant crept forward at just 4 knots, navigating through scattered ice floes that grew increasingly dense. Each impact sent shudders through the ship's hull. The temperature had fallen to 58 degrees, cold enough that exposed metal surfaces could tear skin from any man unwise enough to touch them with bare hands. They had been following the ice pack for nearly 3 hours when the lookout on the starboard wing shouted, "Aircraft! Bearing 170!" A German BV-138 flying boat had appeared from the direction of the Norwegian coast, its 3 engines audible even over the wind. The reconnaissance aircraft banked toward them, clearly preparing for a closer inspection. "Battle stations," Copeland ordered calmly. "Gun crews ready, but hold fire until my command." The flying boat made a single pass at 800 feet, close enough that they could see the observer training his binoculars on the Gallant. Copeland had ordered American flags painted over earlier that morning, replacing them with hastily created Soviet naval ensigns constructed from bed sheets and red paint. "They're coming around again," Davis reported tensely. On its second pass, the German aircraft descended to just 300 feet. Every man on deck held his breath. The disguise was imperfect at best. The distinctive profile of a Liberty ship was difficult to mistake. But in the swirling snow and ice fog, with visibility reduced to less than a quarter mile, perhaps it would be enough. The flying boat completed its circuit and then, to the crew's astonishment, waggled its wings in what appeared to be a casual salute before banking away toward the Norwegian coast. "They bought it!" Davis exhaled in disbelief. "They actually bought it." Copeland wasn't so certain. "Or they're radioing our position to every Kriegsmarine vessel within 200 miles. Maintain course and speed. Let's put as much distance between us and that aircraft as possible." The reprieve lasted less than 2 hours. At 11:40 hours, radar detected 3 fast-moving surface contacts approaching from the southeast. German S-boat torpedo craft, capable of 40 knots in calm seas. The Gallant's maximum speed was 11 knots, and in the ice-strewn waters, they could manage barely 7. "There's no outrunning them," Davis said grimly. Copeland studied the ice pack to their starboard side. "No," he agreed, "but perhaps we can outthink them. Helmsman, come to course 045. Take us into the ice." "Into the ice, sir?" The helmsman's voice cracked with disbelief. "You heard me, quartermaster. Into the ice. All ahead full." The Gallant's engines laboured as the ship increased speed, driving directly toward the solid edge of the polar ice pack. At 7 knots, the Liberty ship smashed through the first barrier of consolidated ice floes, her reinforced bow crumpling the frozen masses like battering rams. Behind them, the S-boats appeared as dark specks on the horizon, closing rapidly. "Engineering reports hull plates buckling in frames 32 through 36, Davis reported, reading from the damage control telephone. "We're taking water in the forward hold." Copeland nodded. "Have damage control teams shore up the affected frames. Keep going." The ship shuddered violently as she crushed through increasingly thick ice. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of tortured metal and splintering ice that drowned out all other sounds. Then, with a final bone-jarring impact, the Gallant broke through into a polinia, an area of open water surrounded entirely by ice. "All stop!" Copeland ordered. "Maintain position." The pursuing S-boats arrived at the edge of the ice barrier 20 minutes later. Through binoculars, Copeland watched as the German commanders assessed the situation. The torpedo boats, with their lightweight hulls designed for speed rather than ice-breaking, could not follow. After circling for nearly an hour, apparently hoping the Gallant would attempt to break back out, they finally departed. "Damage report," Copeland requested when the Germans had disappeared beyond the horizon. The news wasn't good. The Gallant had sustained significant structural damage to her forward hull plates. Water was seeping in through a dozen small breaches, though the pumps were managing to keep pace for now. Worse, the propeller had been damaged by ice impact, limiting their speed to just 5 knots. "Can we continue?" Copeland asked his chief engineer. Roberts wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "She'll float and she'll move, but whether she'll make another 1,000 miles to Murmansk, that's in God's hands, not mine." As darkness fell, a brief 4-hour twilight at these latitudes in March, Copeland gathered his officers again. Their situation was precarious at best. They were trapped in a polynya that might close around them at any time if the winds shifted the ice pack. They had sustained serious damage, and they were still 800 miles from Murmansk. "Options, gentlemen?" Davis spoke first. "We could attempt to break back out to open water and make for Iceland. We're still closer to our departure point than our destination. And run directly into the waiting S-boats?" Copeland shook his head. "No. We press forward." "Forward through what?" the navigation officer protested. "We're surrounded by ice." "For now," Copeland agreed. "But these polynyas form along predictable tidal patterns. This one likely extends as a channel running parallel to the coast. We'll follow it east until we can break out to open water again, hopefully well past the German patrol zones." It was a desperate gamble, a literal shot in the dark. But as Copeland studied the worried faces of his crew, he knew they had come too far to turn back. "Tell the men," he said quietly, "that those tanks in our hold will help decide whether Moscow stands or falls. We're going to deliver them, whatever it takes." March 15th, 1942. Eastern Barents Sea. The ice channel narrowed dangerously as the Gallant pushed eastward. What had begun as a relatively open polynya 2 miles across had contracted to barely 300 yards wide, with pressure ridges of buckled ice towering 20 feet high on either side. The damaged Liberty ship navigated the passage at a crawl, her hull plates groaning with each minor collision. "Pressure's dropping, Captain," Davis reported, studying the barometer. "Storm system moving in from the northeast." Copeland nodded grimly. A barometric pressure drop meant shifting winds, which could drive the ice pack together and crush the Gallant like an eggshell. They needed to find open water, and soon. 4 hours later, with visibility reduced to less than 50 yards in driving snow, lookouts spotted a gap in the eastern ice barrier. Copeland ordered the ship through the narrow opening, hoping to find the open Barents Sea beyond. Instead, they emerged into another polynya, this one significantly smaller than the first. "We're trapped in an ice maze," muttered the navigation officer, his expression bleak as he surveyed the endless white horizon. The Gallant spent the next 30 hours navigating from one polynya to another, following tenuous channels that sometimes narrowed to barely 100 yards, just 15 feet wider than the ship herself. The damage to her hull worsened with each passing hour. Water now filled the forward compartments up to the lower deck, forcing the crew to continuously man the pumps. "Engineering reports the main bearings are overheating," Davis said, returning from an inspection below decks. "Roberts says if we keep pushing her like this, we'll lose the shaft." Before Copeland could respond, a tremendous explosion rocked the ship. The deck beneath them heaved upward, throwing men off their feet. The lights flickered and died. "Report!" Copeland shouted into the darkness as emergency battle lanterns activated automatically. "Aircraft attack, sir," came the response from the lookout. "Came out of the cloud cover. We never saw them coming." A German Ju-88 had scored a direct hit on the Gallant's stern. The bomb had detonated near the rudder assembly, leaving the ship without steering. Worse, the explosion had breached the afterhull, flooding the engine room to a depth of 4 feet and rising rapidly. "Damage control. This is the captain," Copeland called into the sound-powered phone. "Status of the engine room?" Chief Engineer Roberts' voice came back strained but clear. "Main engines offline. Starboard generator damaged beyond repair. Port generator operational but unstable. We have progressive flooding in compartments 12 through 18. Attempting to shore bulkheads, but we're fighting a losing battle, sir." In the background, Copeland could hear the sounds of men working frantically, shouted orders, the clang of tools, the hiss of escaping steam. Then a new sound rose above the chaos, the distinctive drone of aircraft engines returning for another attack run. "All hands, take cover!" Copeland ordered over the ship's announcing system. The Gallant had no operational weapons. Her lone 4-inch gun had been damaged in the collision with the ice pack. One 20mm anti-aircraft mount had been rendered inoperable by ice accumulation. The second had run out of ammunition 2 days earlier after fighting off a Luftwaffe attack. They were defenseless. The Ju-88 made 3 more passes, dropping bombs that exploded in the water close enough to rock the stricken ship violently. By some miracle, none scored direct hits. Perhaps satisfied that the Liberty ship was fatally wounded, the bomber finally departed. Copeland gathered his officers in the chart room, their faces illuminated by the dim red glow of emergency lighting. The damage reports were catastrophic. Without propulsion or steering, adrift in the ice fields, taking on water faster than the pumps could expel it, the Gallant had perhaps 6 hours before she would sink. "Prepare to abandon ship," Copeland ordered, his voice steady despite the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. "Mr. Davis, oversee the preparation of the lifeboats. We'll need to take additional rations and fuel for the stoves. In these temperatures, exposure will kill us faster than the Germans." As Davis moved to carry out the order, a shout came from the lookout on the bridge wing. "Captain, the ice is breaking up ahead of us!" Rushing outside, Copeland was greeted by an extraordinary sight. A massive storm system was driving the polar ice northward, opening a clear channel to open water less than a mile ahead. More remarkably, the same storm was pushing their crippled vessel toward that opening. "The current," Petrov said, appearing at his side. "It's carrying us through." For the next 3 hours, they drifted helplessly on the powerful Arctic current, watching as the ice pack receded behind them. By some navigation miracle, or perhaps divine intervention, as the more religious crewmen believed, they had emerged into the open waters of the eastern Barents Sea. But their situation remained dire. Without power or steering, they were at the mercy of the winds and currents. The Gallant was settling lower in the water by the hour as flooding progressed. "Machinists mate first class." James Hendrickson emerged from below decks, his face blackened with oil and soot, his hands bloodied from hours of work in the flooded engine room. "Captain," he reported, "Chief Roberts thinks we might be able to get the port engine operational. It'll take at least 6 hours, and we'll need every man who can hold a wrench." "Make it happen," Copeland ordered. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary feat of naval engineering improvisation in the Arctic convoys. For 11 straight hours, engineers worked waist-deep in near-freezing water, fighting exhaustion and hypothermia. They cannibalized parts from the starboard engine to repair the port. They fabricated replacement components from whatever materials were available. They manually bailed water from critical compartments when the pumps failed. Gunner's mate Carl Schmidt, his right arm badly burned from a steam leak during an earlier repair, refused medical treatment and continued to assist with the heavy lifting required to realign the damaged propeller shaft. When he finally collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, he was carried to the sickbay only after extracting a promise from Copeland that he would be told when the engines restarted. At 03:10 hours on March 17th, Chief Engineer Roberts called the bridge. "Ready to attempt restart, Captain." Every man on the ship who could find space crowded into the passageways near the engine room. When the damaged port engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, the cheer that went up could have been heard in Norway. True to his word, Copeland went personally to the sickbay to tell Schmidt the news. The gunner's mate managed a weak smile before slipping back into unconsciousness. With one engine operational, the Gallant could make barely 5 knots. Her rudder was jammed 15 degrees to port, forcing the helmsman to constantly compensate with engine adjustments. She rode dangerously low in the water, her forward hold completely flooded and sealed off. But she was moving, limping toward Murmansk through the storm-tossed Barents Sea. The first radio contact with Soviet forces came 30 hours later. A heavily accented voice broke the static. Unidentified vessel approaching Kola Inlet. Identify yourself immediately. This is United States ship Gallant, Copeland replied. Liberty ship from Convoy PQ-13, requesting permission to enter Murmansk harbor. A long silence followed. Then, Gallant, your convoy was reported destroyed. No survivors were expected. As the battered ship approached the Russian coastline, the weather suddenly cleared. Through his binoculars, Copeland could make out the stark outline of the city, cranes silhouetted against the grey sky, the distinctive shape of anti-aircraft emplacements dotting the hills. They had made it. Standing on the bridge, just as he had when they departed Iceland 15 days earlier, Copeland watched the harbour entrance grow larger. His uniform was stiff with dried salt, his beard crusted with ice. He had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since the convoy scattered. Like every man aboard, he had lost weight, his cheeks hollowed by exhaustion and cold. But as the Gallant limped into Murmansk harbour on that grey March afternoon, Captain Robert Copeland allowed himself a brief moment of pride. Against impossible odds, they had delivered their precious cargo, 6 M3 tanks that would be unloaded within hours and sent immediately to the front lines just 200 miles west of Moscow, where the fate of Russia and perhaps the entire war hung in the balance. March 20th, 1942. Murmansk, Soviet Union. The USS Gallant's arrival created a stir unlike anything the war-battered port had witnessed. Soviet dockworkers swarmed the ship before her mooring lines were even secured, preparing to unload the precious cargo she carried. Copeland watched from the listing bridge as a contingent of Red Army officers approached, led by a stern-faced colonel whose chest blazed with medals. "You are the captain who defied the scatter order," the colonel asked without preamble when Copeland descended the gangway to meet the reception committee. "I am," Copeland replied, suddenly aware of how ragged he and his crew appeared after their ordeal. The Russians studied him for a long moment, then did something completely unexpected. He embraced Copeland in a bear hug that nearly crushed the exhausted American's ribs. "You are either the bravest or the most foolish sailor in the Allied fleet," the colonel proclaimed when he finally released him. "Perhaps both, but your tanks arrived at precisely the right moment. The first will roll onto rail cars within the hour, bound for the Kalinin front." Only later did Copeland learn the full significance of his delivery. Of the 31 merchant vessels that had departed Iceland with Convoy PQ-13, only 8 reached Soviet ports. 23 ships had been sunk, the highest percentage loss of any Arctic convoy in the war. The Gallant's cargo of 6 M3 Stuart tanks represented more than 20% of all tanks that made it through from that convoy. 5 days after arriving in Murmansk, a heavily bandaged wireless operator from another convoy vessel appeared at the hospital where Copeland and his most seriously injured men were recovering. He brought copies of intercepted German communications that revealed the fate of the Gallant's pursuers. "The Tirpitz never found the convoy at all," the radio man explained. His voice, raspy from smoke inhalation, suffered when his own ship was sunk. "The intelligence about her departure from Altafjord was accurate, but she was recalled after encountering heavy seas that damaged her forward gun turret. The scatter order was based on a threat that had already disappeared." The bitter irony was not lost on Copeland. 23 ships and hundreds of men had been lost because of a phantom menace, a battleship that had already turned back toward its base when the fateful order was given. "And the S-boats that pursued us along the coast?" Copeland asked. 2 ran aground in shallow water trying to maintain visual contact with you, the radioman replied with a grim smile. "The 3rd struck a mine while returning to its base. Not one survived to report your position." The journey home proved almost as harrowing as the voyage out. The Gallant required 3 weeks of emergency repairs before she was deemed seaworthy enough to attempt the return passage. Even then, no naval architect would have certified her condition. The forward holds remained flooded and sealed. The hull plates were patched with a makeshift combination of Soviet steel and concrete. The single functioning engine could produce barely 60% of its rated power. Copeland chose to sail independently rather than waiting for the formation of the next return convoy. The decision violated standing orders but reflected his tactical assessment. A lone vessel moving along an unexpected course might slip through unnoticed, while the large, slow convoys were being targeted with devastating effectiveness. The gamble paid off. The Gallant made the crossing back to Iceland without encountering enemy forces, though twice they were forced to halt for emergency repairs to the overtaxed engine. They arrived in Reykjavik on May 3, 1942, 59 days after their departure. A naval inquiry awaited Copeland. His decision to disobey the scatter order, to deliberately sail toward enemy-held territory, and to return independently all constituted serious violations of convoy protocol. The preliminary recommendation was court-martial. Then the statistical analysis of Arctic convoy losses reached the Admiralty. Of the 715 merchant vessels that had attempted the Murmansk run between 1941 and 1943, 153 were lost to enemy action, a staggering 21% casualty rate. But when the analysts broke down the figures by convoy versus independent sailings, they discovered something remarkable. Ships that scattered when threatened actually suffered higher losses than those that maintained formation. And vessels that had attempted Copeland's extreme coastal route, there were 7 documented cases by war's end, had a survival rate of 85% compared to 65% for the standard route. The court-martial recommendation was quietly withdrawn. In its place came the Navy Cross, presented to Copeland in a ceremony at Norfolk Naval Yard on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. The citation made no mention of his disobedience, focusing instead on his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession. Copeland commanded 3 more Liberty ships on the Murmansk run before being promoted to command a destroyer escort in the Pacific Theater for the final year of the war. None of those later voyages matched the desperate intensity of that first Arctic crossing. After the war, Copeland returned to the Merchant Marine, eventually becoming port captain for a major shipping line in New Orleans. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, deflecting praise with the observation that he had simply done what any sailor would do when faced with impossible choices. In 1956, a Soviet delegation visiting the United States as part of a cultural exchange program made a special journey to New Orleans. Among them was a general who had commanded tank forces at the Battle of Moscow. Through an interpreter, he told Copeland that one of the M3 Stuart tanks delivered by the Gallant had been his personal command vehicle during the Soviet counteroffensive in early 1942. "Your tank," the general said, pressing a small metal object into Copeland's palm, "killed 17 German panzers before it was destroyed outside Smolensk. I kept this piece of its armor as a talisman for the remainder of the war." The fragment of American steel, bent and scarred by combat, became Copeland's most treasured possession. Tangible proof that his insane Arctic run had directly influenced the course of the war on the Eastern Front. The toll of those Arctic convoys extended far beyond the ships and men lost during the voyages themselves. Many survivors suffered lifelong health problems resulting from their exposure to extreme conditions. The constant fear of attack, combined with the relentless physical punishment of Arctic seafaring, left psychological scars that never fully healed. Boatswain Patrick O'Malley, the oldest member of the Gallant's crew, developed chronic respiratory disease from hours spent working on ice-covered decks in sub-zero temperatures. He died in 1950, his lungs permanently damaged. Machinist's mate James Hendrickson, who had worked thigh-deep in freezing water to repair the Gallant's engines, suffered from circulatory problems for the rest of his life, eventually losing both legs to complications from frostbite injuries that had never properly healed. Gunner's mate Carl Schmidt, who had refused treatment for his burns until the engine was repaired, carried those scars as visible reminders of the voyage. In civilian life, he became an advocate for merchant marine veterans, fighting for recognition of their service and improved medical care for their unique injuries. In a 1975 interview, 3 years before his death from heart failure, Copeland reflected on the significance of the Arctic convoys. We were ordinary men asked to do an extraordinary job with inadequate tools and impossible odds. That we succeeded at all was a testament not to individual heroism, but to the collective determination of Allied sailors who understood that every tank, every plane, every bullet we delivered meant Russian soldiers could keep fighting and dying, so that perhaps fewer American boys would have to do the same on some future battlefield. Today, maritime historians recognize Copeland's insane coastal route as a tactical innovation that saved countless lives once it was incorporated into convoy planning. Modern Arctic shipping still references the Copeland Channel when navigating certain passages along the Norwegian coast during ice season. In the Naval War College curriculum, Operation Wunderlander, the German plan to intercept Arctic convoys with surface raiders, is studied alongside Copeland's counter-strategy as a classic example of asymmetric tactical thinking. His decision to deliberately sail toward enemy territory rather than away from it is presented as a case study in calculated risk-taking against overwhelming odds. But perhaps the most fitting memorial came in 2005, when a Russian naval officer visiting the USS Constitution Museum in Boston paused before a small display about the Arctic convoys. He pointed to a faded photograph of a Liberty ship entering Murmansk harbor, her hull scarred and listing. "My grandfather," he told the American curator, "commanded a tank battalion at Kursk. He always said he owed his life to an American captain who brought tanks through the ice when everyone else turned back." The photograph was of the USS Gallant.